Hey guys and girls, and welcome back to episode 3 in the series where we are going to build a GraphQL API in Elixir. So what I want to do in this episode is implement our first user model, but before we do that, I want to quickly go over two things that I don't think I explained well enough in the last episode, which is that in order to make your database work on your local machine, you have to go into your config folder in your config file that says dev. And here you can see the username and the password that your Phoenix app is going to use to connect to your local database. In this case, it's going to use Postgres and Postgres as the credentials, but just make sure that you put in your own credentials for the database that's running on your local machine. Or you can go into your command line and type in psql to open the SQLize command line, and then paste in or type in this command, which tells your database to create a new super user with a username of Postgres and a password of Postgres, which makes it easier because the next time you create a new Phoenix project, you don't have to change these settings. You can just forget about it. So the other thing is that in my user settings in Visual Studio Code, so if we open my user settings, I put in this block, which tells my Visual Studio Code that whenever I'm working with a file that has the language Elixir, I will run the formatter on every save and whenever I paste in code. So make sure that in your user settings you have this block as well. I use an extension that is called settings sync, which makes a gist on GitHub and puts in all your user settings and downloads it whenever you open your code editor, which is really handy if you use Visual Studio Code on multiple machines and you want to make sure that your user settings are the same on every instance of Visual Studio Code. And there's a link in the description that directs you to a gist of mine where I put in all my user settings. So if you get the extension, you can reference that gist and download all the user settings that I use, or you can just copy paste them and put them in your user settings. All right, so let's get started implementing our first model. So I'm gonna get back into our project folder, close this, and we're gonna make a new branch with git flow. So let's do that by typing in git flow feature start, and we're going to call it implement user model. Great, it created a branch. And then we're going to type in mix phoenix.generate, and we're going to generate a new context. And a context is like a subfolder in your application that divides the different logics in your application. So in our case, we are going to make an accounts folder or an accounts context. And in that folder, we are going to have a user model. Then we need to specify the table name in the database, which is going to be users. And then we need to give it the rows, well, not the rows, the columns in our database. And if we look at our database scheme, we have a first name, a last name, an email, a password, and a role. So let's add that. So we're going to need a first name. And you can specify what it's going to be by doing a semicolon and then typing in, for example, string, text, integer, stuff like that. But because we're using a string, by default, it's always going to be a string, so we don't need to type that in. Then we're going to need a last name, and we're going to need an email field. We need a password hash field, and we're going to need a role field. So let's hit enter and check out what Phoenix is going to generate for us. There we go. So as you can see, a few files are created. So in our lib folder, we now have, we have nothing. That's strange. I'm just going to quickly close this editor and open it again. This sometimes happens on my computer. I'm not sure why. So if we check out at the moment what we have, there we go. So now we have in our folder, we have an accounts folder with the accounts file, which contains all the CRUD functionality of our app. We have our user model with the fields that we specified. We have in our private folder our migration, which we are going to add some stuff to in a second. And then we have our test folder with our account tests, but we won't touch that for now. All right. So because we generated the files, we are going to run the formatter on the files that were just created. And it's not formatter, it's format. There we go. And then we're going to add this. So git add. And I have a new keyboard, which is really annoying because it's a little bit off. We're going to add the file and we're going to give it a commit message. Scaffold user model files. All right. Let's clear that up. Okay, so now that we've told Phoenix that we're going to have a user data structure in our application, we want to make sure that we have some validation on this model. Because in a real-world application, you want to make sure that if a user, for example, gives us an email, we want to make sure that there is an @ sign in it. If he gives us a password, we want to make sure that the password is certain characters long and stuff like that. So if we go into our lib folder again and we go to the accounts context and to the user model, we can see on the top of the file that it's going to import some function from Ecto. And what Ecto is like a database adapter that gives us some functions that makes it really easy to interact with the database. And as you can see, it's using the schema function. And what this Ecto schema function is going to give us, so that's this whole block up here, it's going to return a struct. And a struct in Phoenix is like a map. And if you don't know what a map in Phoenix is, it's like an object in JavaScript. It's going to give us a map with some predefined values. So in a struct in Phoenix, you just can't add stuff to it unless you specify it beforehand. So that's what we're doing in this code block. We're saying, okay, we want to create a struct with a key value pair of email and then a string. First name and a string, last name, password hash, and stuff like that. Okay, so if we want to check out that struct that the Ecto schema function gave us, let's go into our terminal and type in iex-s mix. And this is going to compile our whole project. And now we can reference all the functions in our project and just play around with it. So I want to reference this module. We're going to use the accounts.user module. And because it's such a long name, we can alias it in Phoenix by typing in alias medium GraphQL API .accounts.user. Oh, and it has to be capital user. And this is what this is going to do is we can now just reference capital user instead of typing in the whole module name. As you can see, so if we now type user, it's going to reference the module with the full name. So if we want to look at the structs, a map in Phoenix looks like this. It's a percentage sign and then curly braces. A struct looks almost the same, but it has the module name before it, which is going to be user in our case. And if we type enter, we can take a look at what's inside this map. We can see that there is an Ecto schema metadata key and value. That's something that Ecto is going to give us, and we're going to go into that in a second. But what else is in there is an email field, a first name, an ID, inserted that last name, password hash, role, and updated that. And that's pretty much exactly what we specified here. By default, you are always going to get an ID field, inserted at, and updated at fields. Okay, so let's quickly get out of the terminal by typing in Ctrl+C twice. And what we want to do now is put in some validation into our struct. So what we want to do is, because we are using the email address as like this unique identifier, we don't want to have people sign up twice with the same email address. We can specify that by typing in unique and then saying that has to be true. Then what else do we want to have? We want to go to our role fields, and by default, when someone signs up, we want to say that the default value of this field is going to be a string with a user role. And then what we want to do is we have a password hash field here, But a user is not just going to give us his password hash. We have to do that. But what the user is going to give us is a password, which is going to be a string, and a password underscore confirmation field, and that is also going to be a string. This is going to make sense in a second. But those two fields are not fields we want to persist into our database. We just want to be able to check if they are provided by the user and do some validation on them, but we don't want to save them in the database. So what you can do in this struct is tell it, okay, this is a field, but it's only going to be there for checking. We're not going to persist it in the database. So you specify that by using virtual true. And in here, we're going to say virtual true as well. Okay, so we expanded our struct that Ecto is going to give us. So we can check that by going back into our terminal and going into the IAX shell by typing in IAX-s mix, which is going to compile our project again. And we're going to again alias this module, which is medium GraphQL API .accounts.user. And if we take a look at our user struct, we can see that it now has a password confirmation field and a password field, and that by default our role is going to be user. So that's awesome. Okay, let's get back out of it. So if you specify that a field in your struct has to be unique, you also have to specify that by adding it to your migration file. Because whenever you say the email that the user is going to provide us has to be unique, it has to go into the database, it needs to check if a user with that email already exists, and it has to go back and tell you that. So because we need to go into our database, we need to add that to our migration file. So in our migration file, we can see that this is a function that is going to create this table in our database, and we need to give it some extra values. We need to say create, and what we want to create is a unique index, and the unique index function is going to take in the table name, which is users, and then what do we want to be unique on this table, and for us it's going to be the email field. Okay, so let's save that. And now we can run our migration, and we do that by running mix ecto.migrate. So it run our migration. If we take a look in our database, I'm gonna open Postico, connect to our database, go into our medium GraphQL API development database, go into our user table, and we can see that it's run the migration. It created a first name, last name, email, password, hash, role, columns. So that is all correct. And if we go to structure, we can see that user email index is a unique index with the column name email. So this is how your database is going to index your emails, and it's going to give every email a unique number so that it can easily look up if that number already exists. Okay, so in essence, what we have done now is we've told Phoenix that whenever we reference the user model, this is what it should look like. It should be a structure with the fields that we specified in this file. So if we go down, we see that there's a changeset function. And what a changeset function is it accepts a user struct. So that is what we defined above here. And then it accepts a argument called attributes. And the attributes are what the user is going to give us. And what we do in this function is we try to combine them together. So we want to see if the attributes match the user. If it's true, we want to say, okay, this is valid data. We can put it in the database. If they don't match, we want to make sure that we don't corrupt our database and that this changeset function is going to give back an error and it's going to tell us why we can't put it in a database. For example, the passwords don't match, the email already exists. What else is there? The role is not set, stuff like that. So if we take a look at the changeset function, you can see that the first function that our user struct is going to go in is the cast function. And what the cast function is going to do, it's going to put in the attributes that we provided into the user struct. So all the data that we want to validate and want to work with, we need to provide that into this list. So what we do know is that a user is not going to give a password hash. So we don't need that at the moment. What we do need is a password. And what we also are going to get from a user is a password confirmation field. Okay, then the next function is going to be validate required. And what this means is in this function, we're going to specify all the fields that we know that we're going to need in our database. So all the functions that the user has to give, otherwise we're going to get back an error from Ecto. So what we want to put in here is pretty much the same what we put in the cast function. So first name, a last name, an email, not a password hash, we just need a password from the user. And we need the password confirmation. And also the role, but that one is by default. Then the next thing that we want to do is we're going to pipe it through another function. And if you want to see all the functions that Ecto has in their changeset function, just click on it, go in there, and you can see all the functions that it has. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to go over all of them, but I would strongly suggest just reading about them in this file. It's really helpful. So yeah, do that. So the next function we want to use in our changeset is we want to validate that our email is correctly formatted. So what we can do is we can say validate, and not required, but format. And this function takes in the key of the struct, and then as a second argument you are going to give it the regular expression, which is going to start with a tilde r/@ because we want to make sure that there's an @sign in it, and then we can close this function. So that is to validate our email address. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that our email address is actually downcased. So we can say email, and then we can reference the string module, uppercase, string.downcase. There it is. And what we want to downcase is the first argument, which is going to be number 1. Okay, next thing, what do we want to do? We want to validate, not required, but we want to validate the length. And we want to validate the length of the password. And we want to specify that it should have minimal of 6 characters and a max of, let's say, 100. Next thing, we want to pipe it into the function that is called validate confirmation. And what this is going to do by default is it is going to take in the password key. And because we specified password confirmation exactly the same as the word confirmation, it is going to check the password and the password confirmation keys and see if they're exactly the same. So that's amazing. Okay, then we want to make sure that our email is unique by telling Ecto unique constraint and giving it the key email. And then the last thing we're going to do is, and this is a function that Ecto doesn't have, but we're going to make it, is we're going to say, okay, we have everything now. Let's hash the password that the user gave us. And in this module, beneath the changeset, we are going to make a private function that is going to say hash password. Oh, my keyboard. Has password. It's going to take in the changeset. and we're going to do something. We're going to do it in the next episode. So for now, let's return the change set. Not the actual change set, but actually the argument that we gave it, which is the change set. Oh, and before I forgot to end this function, I see. There we go, let's save it. There we go, and now the formatter is running and we can see that. It put everything in a nice format. That is awesome. Okay, that's it for this episode. So what we're going to do in the next episode is actually implement the hash password feature. So for now, I'm just going to go into my terminal. I'm going to clear this. And if we take a look at our Git status, we modified 2 files. So to be able to modify that quickly and correctly, I'm going to stage this by pressing this and saying that is our user model. Implement user model validation, and we're going to stage this, and we're going to say add unique index to email to user email field in migration. Okay, so let's check everything is clean. Now let's say git flow feature finish, and it's gonna merge it into the development branch, and I'm gonna push that to GitHub. So git push origin develop. There we go. And now everything is nice and clean. So thank you for watching. I hope everything was clear. If not, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.